There is one moment in Chainsaw Man that sums this series up better than most. When Kashibe is assigned by Makima to train Denji in power, he asks them three questions before getting started. Number 1, how do you feel about your comrades dying? Number 2, do you seek revenge? And number 3, humans or devils, which side are you on? For the first two questions, Denji and Power respond unfazed with unaffected answers. For the third question though, humans or devils, which side are you on? Both take a beat, then Power answers, the side that's winning. Denji answers, the side that'll take care of me. There's something about Power's allegiance to no one and Denji's desire to find protection at any cost that give you a sensation of feeling something, I don't know, perhaps sweet yet fucked at the same time. Side by side, I'd argue their answers embody the tone of Chainsaw Man, which I can only best classify as dementedly wholesome, becoming that certain secret sauce sometimes hard to identify in Chainsaw Man. But the series also manages to pull this off not only in this moment, but as a whole with its eccentric, bloody story filled with its band of weirdo characters, some subtle and some not so subtle. So journey with me as I look at three elements that shape this dementedly wholesome tone, making Chainsaw Man the disgusting, heart-filled piece of art that it is. And a heads up, I'm currently reading the manga, but I've intentionally stopped where season 1 ended so that I could focus and analyze on this subject within the boundaries of what we've got with the anime alone so far. Rather than complicate things with what happens in the manga that we haven't seen in the anime yet, I'm sort of treating season 1 as if it were a standalone. Alright, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to it. Ever since you were little, you've always sprinkled a pinch of fantasy into everything. That's a line from Goodbye Eri, a one-shot manga from the creator of Chainsaw Man, Tatsuki Fujimoto. This line is something the main character Yuta mentions at one point, that he likes to add an element of fantasy and suspended belief in the movies that he makes. In this case, he makes his friend Eri a vampire in the movie he's creating about her. Now, Goodbye Eri isn't about vampires. It's actually a deeply dramatic and at times very dark story about dealing with the best way to remember someone once they've passed, and motivating oneself to keep going in the wake of tragedy and loss. But then there's some twisted and supernatural elements peppered in there, like characters actually turning into vampires and running away from an exploding hospital Yuta's dying mother is in as if it were a blockbuster film. Where Tatsuki aims to tell his story, he too doesn't shy from sprinkling in his own bit of fantasy. Another Tatsuki one-shot called Look Back is another dramatic story about a young mangaka's journey as she struggles with tragedy and self-motivation, but there's a time travel component placed in there that makes it all the more fantastical and, therefore, more interesting. Chainsaw Man, I'd argue, is working with the same formula, except it takes the opposite approach of adding a bit of fantasy. Instead, Chainsaw Man adds a little bit of realism to a world where fantasy is commonplace. I mean, we are talking about a teenager with a chainsaw dog devil for a heart, working his way down a list of pubescent goals while encountering things like the tomato devil, the sea cucumber devil, and the menacing big bad in the shadows, the gun devil, all the while trying to figure out what's worth living for in this simple luxury of a life he's happened to stumble into. I think Tatsuki's main goal in his manga is to explore the human condition of his characters, but at the same time he has no interest in heavily handing the message to you, hence the tendency to add a bit of fantasy or realism to just downplay how over-the-top or meaningful something should be. In Chainsaw Man's case, he's telling a story about Denji, a kid looking to fulfill a certain dream, something we've seen time and time again in manga and anime. But instead of building that dream from a place of super profoundfulness, Tatsuki makes it less obvious by making Denji's goals and motivations questionable at best, all to undersell the significance of the message he's trying to deliver. Why? Well, here's my take on it. Seeing a glimmer of wholesomeness in a satirical and demented world is an interesting way to tell a traditional story that's been told thousands of times the same way before. You know the whole shtick with the noble protagonist hero with a heart of gold that only acts towards their good intentions. But Chainsaw Man leaves you doubting that the characters in this type of story can be sincere, do the right thing, or even necessarily become good people. So you're left pleasantly surprised and fulfilled when they actually do or become that, even if it is just for a fleeting split second. Tatsuki as a mangaka definitely has an eye for finding these unique sweet spots to usher in significance and wholesome meaningfulness where it was consistently understated up to that point. The main characters of Chainsaw Man don't give a lot away in terms of their progression or development. When someone happens to stumble upon a lesson or a moment of growth, you may miss it if you're not paying attention. Denji is the exception to this rule because A, he's the poster boy of the show, and B, we're given a peek at his inner dialogue as he struggles with things like deciding if he loves the chase of a dream or actually fulfilling it.
俺はずっと追いかけていたもんをやっと掴んだんです。でもいざ掴んでみるとそんなもんは、これから俺がまた何か違うもんを追いかけて掴んだ時も、追いかけてた頃の方が幸せだったって思うんじゃねえのかって。
Like once he finally gets the chance to fondle power and is underwhelmed.
こんなもん
But we don't really get to see much inner dialogue from the other characters, so their journey is more murky in terms of how they come to grow for the better. So though Denji's story is obviously central to everything Chainsaw Man, I'd like to explore the dementedly wholesome tone through the lens of other characters' development. For instance, let's look at Power. We're given one big exposition into Power's life when she first finds Meowie in the woods. She tells the scrawny and hungry cat that she'll fatten her up so that she can eat her. 1 point for Demented. Next, she goes around murdering animals in a gory montage of scenes, feeding and providing for Meowie in the process. Another point for Demented, and a half a point for Wholesome. Next, we see that Meowie has grown on Power, and finally she's found some loving connection with something from the human world. 1 big point for Wholesome. But there was 1 point we missed. Why would Power fatten up some scrawny cat to eat when she has access to other bigger animals? I mean, maybe she's evil, and that's certainly not out of the question, but I think it's obvious. Meowie never had to grow on Power. She fell in love with her from the start. An entire Wholesome point went completely undetected during their first encounter. Another meaningful moment disguised as Demented is Denji and Aki's ball-busting contest on Katana Man in the Season 1 finale. The obvious Wholesome point here goes to Aki and Denji forming a kinship by smashing someone else's balls instead of each other's. The Demented points need not even be addressed because, I mean, come on. The less obvious Wholesome point comes from how nicely Aki's Season 1 arc ties up in this moment. Here you have this controlled and regimented guy consumed with so much revenge that he's ready to discard his own life and forsake any potential joy for himself or with anyone else. In contrast, before she died, Himeno took on the opposite approach. She sought a life outside of devil hunting but couldn't bring herself to leave the one she loved behind. Unlike Aki, she tended to live a personal chaotic life but also never took it for granted, especially after watching 6 of her previous partners die. In the end, her desire to see Aki find some scrap of happiness leads to her sacrificing her life to save him. So seeing Aki let go for once and allow himself to have fun with Denji is just nice in this moment, because it makes Himeno's sacrifice that much more worth it. It's what she would have wanted for him before he goes on to what I presume will be getting brutally murdered as the future devil predicts. Then there's Makima, the walking talking embodiment of wholesomely demented. If Denji is the poster wild child of this tone, Makima is its very intentional manic pixie dream girl, holding the leash on Denji as the manipulative architect behind all of his motivation. She's able to simultaneously teach him some genuine lessons about love and connection. Her intuition is so attuned to what Denji is looking for that it's kind of terrifying to witness a character emotionally dig their claws into someone that they may be sending on a death march. While she offers Denji anything in return for killing the gun devil, including insinuating that she'll have sex with him if he does so, she doesn't fail to hit a nerve on the things Denji is truly looking to feel as a quote-unquote normal human. The unsettling part is you see nothing but calmness and poise from Makima, so essentially nothing is off the table in order for her to meet her goals, including giving the Yakuza their loved one's eyeballs, before sweetly assuring them that they can be returned. Of course, I'm very eager to see what mystery lies behind the veil with Makima as I read on, but for now she manages to be perfectly innocuous as she is menacing. What's fascinating about the context and story of Chainsaw Man is its mundane backdrop for its very shonen premise. We're introduced to a world full of devils and government-sanctioned hunters, but also to a world that appears no more ordinary than ours today. There's a relatable contemporariness to it all. Public safety reflects much of typical Japanese modern work culture, with customary after-work drinking get-togethers, and Hobeni deciding to stay on with the organization, despite her severe trauma following her stay in the hotel with the Eternity Devil, plainly because bonuses are coming up. And of course, the Gun Devil first appears in the United States, where gun violence is very rampant. You can tell this world has been this way for a while due to the fact that your standard government and even private agencies have been established to combat devils, and because coexisting with this threat seems to be the status quo. So I don't know what's really more demented, depicting a world where this is the norm and people have just accepted it, or the fact that it's meant to reflect our actual world now. I guess that relatableness to our everyday life is also what kind of makes it wholesome in a weird, messed up way as well. I mentioned that Tatsuki's plots are simply fronts for the real story at hand, the characters. When you take this into account and take a step back, you really start to see how stupidly simple the story is. There are devils in this world, and there's this one really bad devil. Again, he's called the fucking gun devil. I mean, it's so deliberately on the nose that it hurts. But then there's this kid that can turn into chainsaws and might be crazy enough to try to kill him. From the start to the end of Season 1, that's really all there is to the narrative that keeps the show moving. I may be stating the obvious here, but I'm a firm believer that Tatsuki's choice of something so basic and rather unoriginal in terms of how much other devil-related manga and anime is out there, that this was a satirical choice, and Tatsuki is just laughing at us for biting on yet another show about hunting devils. Notch another point for Demented. Chainsaw Man intrigues you because it builds those familiar expectations up going into it with its cool bloody fights and action, but if you peel it back, all it really is a lot of characters struggling with their shit. And that shit is sometimes pedestrian and other times heavier, but regardless, it's all very mature and real stuff they're dealing with. Yet another point for wholesome. And finally, looking at other characters' stories, we're led to believe that some of these characters will be more or less your familiar trope figures regularly found in manga. However, that's not always the case. Look at Katana Man. You might believe him to be just another one-dimensional villain. But before his final bout with the Denji, he makes it clear that he's just upset that his grandfather died. Believing him to be a good man, he just wanted to feel some remorse from Denji. It creates something of a temporary moment of empathy for Katana, but that's quickly demolished when Denji refuses to apologize with a big fat nah, and the fight begins. Kishibe is a numb drunkard that's all about boozing, killing, and chasing women. But during his dinner with Makima, he admits that Denji and Power have grown on him while training them, though he brutally murders them countless times a day. Caring for the people you get to enjoy murdering over and over again may be the most blatantly demented wholesome thing you can do. While these tropey manga characters are very much over the top and very overpowered, as you would expect a main villain or sensei character found in manga to be, they're still blessed with those everyday boring, recognizable human fears, sentiments, and feelings. I'm very eager to jump back into the manga to see how my thoughts here today may change or be validated. Regardless, if Chainsaw Man Season 1 were actually a standalone story, I still think it would work. It's refreshing to see characters grow, but also not grow too much, because rarely in real life do people have the luxury of being able to change so quickly. While heroic stories and wholesomeness have always gone hand in hand together, Chainsaw Man's demented nature keeps it grounded in a way that makes Season 1 feel conclusive if it wanted to be. For whatever these characters will achieve going forward, there will most certainly be an equal amount of sourness to humble that success. Season 1 felt like it met that particular mark, but I am very ready to jump back in to get the whole story that I'm sure will continue to push the limits on what we can call dementedly wholesome. Chainsaw Man, you make me cry, you also make me puke. Never change.